All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cognition Ignition. Thanks for being here. And I'm just kind of taking after Jordan Peterson. He goes on these quests, right? And I was like, maybe I could go on a quest. I don't think I'm nearly as smart as Jordan Peterson. Um, but I have listened to him a lot. And if I'm being honest, I actually miss that he doesn't put out his podcast like he usually does. And right now, I see he's putting out some of his lectures back onto into the podcast space, and I've been listening to them. And a lot of what my channel has become has been encouraging men to kind of speak up about their truths, their experiences, and um, kind of help other people grow. Kind of fill the shoes of Jordan Peterson while we were waiting for him to get better. And I think Jordan Peterson was filling the shoes of people like Jung and Freud and a bunch of other people who were thinking past the surface level interpretation of reality. Um, and I think it's a very hard thing to do, but it is worth doing. When somebody like Jordan Peterson came out or Carl Jung, they kind of, I think, set the direction for masculine people to kind of find their way in the world in a more holistic, all encompassing sense by bringing up things like archetypes and pattern recognition or um, the anima and animus. These are the archetypes within us, right? Um, and over the past 7 or 8 years, I have been using these models to help myself navigate reality because the archetypes are patterns of reality. Jung never really defined the archetypes in their entirety. The reason that Jung never really was able to identify all of the archetypes um, was because they exist at different levels of analysis. Now, what does that really mean? It means that they are all encompassing. You can look at the archetypes from a biological perspective, or you can look at the archetypes from a cosmic perspective, or anywhere in between there. In modern like biology and psychology, I would relate the archetypes to epigenetics in a way. When yourself interacts with the zeitgeist in a specific way, changes within you occur, and those are the archetypes that are emerging. And some archetypes emerge because that is what is called for in the zeitgeist, and sometimes they do not emerge because of the condition of the zeitgeist at any given time. A big thing about it is that it is an archetype. So that means that there is an actual arc to it. There's a starting point. There are points within the middle, and then there's an end point. So you can kind of look at the starting point as the beginning of your life, and then the end point as the end of your life. And it's everything that was that was that had occurred within those points of your life. And then, the archetype is about wholeness. What we usually see is one-sidedness, but the archetype at the other end of the archetype is everything that was still unconscious to you in a way. And the thing about archetypes is like the way I've used them for years, like on this channel with personality types, is you can see the archetypal patterns of an individual. That is without a doubt. But then, there are other ways to get a little bit more analytical with it, where, you can see archetypal patterns within an individual. I guess it goes along with Carl Jung's cognitive functions. And his idea is that, like, the idea that, like, you know, there is a hero function within each person. And then, Myers-Briggs captured that, and they actually did they identified our common archetypes within basically the United States. We are a capitalist country. We were moving towards basically building up the country, putting people into the workplace, educating people, and doing things like that. So within that, there were a bunch of patterns of people that were needed. So for one, like the idea, one of Carl Jung's cognitive functions is extroverted thinking. Archetypally, it's related to like a CEO in the Myers and Briggs assessment, right? So archetypally, that extroverted thinker is a CEO, and then so that means that is his hero. That like when somebody who is an extroverted thinker uses that function or expresses that function or the components of that function, he is he will appear archetypally like a hero. He will be doing something that has an impact, and he will do it better than people who don't have that function as a hero would do it. And then there are also like feelers. And a lot of times these are like the people who build communities, um, set social standards, or and when they are doing that, they are engaging with people. This is a pattern. You would see them engaging with people, directing people, moving people, um, being compassionate with people. These are all micro patterns within that larger archetype of extroverted feeling. And when an extroverted feeler integrates all of those different patterns, they will look like a hero using that function. And the reason I wanted to start here was because I think it goes really good with Carl Jung's idea of the great man. Basically, he talked about a tribe that was a bit more primitive than what we see in modern society. He talked about the Naskapi. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. I read it, so um, that is how I am pronouncing it. And basically, his idea was that because they did not have a social structure the way we see now. They didn't have any religious beliefs. They didn't have a community. They were basically living on their own, individually, one at a time. Like they would be born, they would get raised, and then they would go out and do their own hunting. And his idea of this, with this story, was that he was trying to think of like how did they know what to do? How did they know to go hunting? How did they know to prepare their food? How did they know how to live and all these things? And how the story goes is they would um, they would listen to their inner voice, which is basically um, the self um, and the great man. You can look at the self and the great man in alignment, and both of these are archetypes, like the pattern of having a conversation in your head. And he gave it the archetype of the great man, and then there's also the self, and then so that's in the middle. So that's why I started with personality, just kind of explaining like there are these archetypal patterns of people. If you went one way, you would get to the ego. If you went to the other way, you would get to um, the shadow and the anima. Um, and each of those are archetypes. So the ego is basically how you fulfill the hero archetype, right? And then the anima is based on your sex. So if you are a male, you will have the anima. And if you are a female, you will have the animus. And it is the opposite energy of your biological sex, basically. And the idea is that this comes online later in a person's life. So for a man, it could be like, when he has children, maybe he becomes more compassionate. Um, Also, maybe like a lot of times when men went to war and they saw um, their companions die, or the men that they were working with die, maybe they became affected by that emotionally, right? And that is the idea of the anima, and then this continues on through life. And I think that is a male integrating the feminine side, not necessarily becoming a female, but accepting the fact that there needs to be this balance of their toughness and their aggressiveness and the rigidness with the kindness and compassion actually needed to move things forward, get people on board with you, right? Um, and then there's the shadow, which are other parts of yourself which may have been neglected. And I would say these are probably more of the characteristics that would relate to your sex, right? So if you're a male, like maybe you acted cowardly. Maybe you didn't confront evil when it was in front of you or something like that, right? And so then your ability to confront evil or be aggressive in the face of evil and take action is in your shadow, right? So we have that. You have your great man, which is the inner voice inside your head. Um, and Carl's young, and then on each end of that, you have the ego, which is the stuff that you choose to do, the shadow, the stuff that you choose not to do, not to integrate, basically. Um, and then, within that, there were other archetypes, the trickster, um, the animal, like I said, the critic. And Carl Jung said that basically the way that the Naskapi tribe was able to survive was by listening to the voice inside her head. And he was also explaining that in modern times, people are not in touch with that voice inside their head. So then, that maybe because people aren't actually in touch with the voice inside their head, we see some of the chaos that we see in society, and we see some of the bad behaviors we see in society, because we aren't in touch with the great man, the inner voice that knows where we are going. He compares this to a seed in a way. If you had a pine tree, or if you had a seed for a pine tree, it has everything that that pine will need for its life to get to where it needs to be. And that's the idea of the great man. It knows everything you need to get to where you need to be. You would need to listen to it. And that's the archetype. There's just a bunch of ways that like civilizations have interpreted this voice, this inner substrate that holds all the memories and can direct your growth and things like that. My channel started as talking about personality. And as I got more into learning psychology, sociology, and more into Jung, listening more to Jordan Peterson, I started to realize like Jung wasn't really talking about personality. He was talking about an entire social system. It really was. So what I'll do is I'll share this clip of Jordan Peterson, and then I will read this one. This was The Undiscovered Self. I'm just going to read the back of it, and you're going to kind of get an idea of the bigger picture that Carl Jung was seeing, and I think it's going to help a lot of people.
Now, when Jung talked about archetypes, it was never clear what he meant, and I think the reason for that was because the archetype is a very complicated idea and a very complicated phenomena, and you can think about it biologically, and you can think about it socially, and you can think about it as something that the individual participates in creating. So it's not that easy to localize it, and as well, it's not that easy to localize it, and as well, Jung was never clear about what the universe of archetypes looked like. At some times he spoke as if they were a relatively small number, and then at other times he spoke as if they were innumerable. And I think the reason for that is in part, it depends on the level of analysis, right? The more transcendent the archetype, the fewer they are, but they differentiate, because you might say, well, how many hero archetypes are there? And one answer could be one, but they differentiate all the way out into the diverse range of works of fiction that we have. So you could say there's as many variants of the hero archetype, roughly speaking, as there are works of fiction. So you think about it as a hierarchy with the ultimate archetype at the top.
All right, so what you're hearing from Jordan Peterson right here is that there is no real understanding of how many archetypes there are. And he says it's because that you can look at it through different levels of analysis, and that basically no one's ever mapped out the entire universe of archetypes. The reason is because you can look at that at different scales. So one good way to really look at this is that like there are the archetypes of a government. And, you could just you can look at this as the president has one archetype, like a leader archetype, which is very similar to a CEO archetype in a business, except the president is running a nation, right? And then below him, he has cabinets, which he has people in his cabinet, right? And all those people have the same archetype as him within their subgroups. So like the director of health is playing the same archetypal role, but the people underneath him is a smaller group. And then, he has different groups that work, in each state, right? For this justice director of health, and then he puts somebody in charge of those. And then each of those are basically acting on that pattern of extroverted thinking, which is about creating systems, building systems, moving towards a goal, completing something, using metrics, and then, relaying those metrics and then deciding what to do with it. And these archetypes will continue to like work up that hierarchy. And then within that, you also have extroverted feelers. So with the extroverted feelers, maybe they are looking, how do we build cohesiveness in a society? And this is something I'm going to show in another video after we finish watching Jordan Peterson. Actually, you know what? I think we should watch it right now. I'm going to show you two different archetypes in politics that sit at the top of the hierarchy because they were both presidents. And I'm going to show you their victory speech because I think that kind of shows you, they were fulfilling the same archetype in a different way. And what you're going to see is that the archetype it's triggering both feeling and thought. It is basically something that is all encompassing because it expresses the past, the present, and the future. It brings up the problems of the past and the plans for the future. It triggers somebody's thoughts and feelings. It gets them to think about who they are in relation to this idea. And then it propagates that idea farther. And, when a president gets elected, every cabinet member underneath him gets on board with his idea, his ideology. It becomes a meme of like, hey, we are going to do this. This is what we're working towards. So let's look at both of these videos and then we'll come back to Jordan Peterson in just a second. Because I'd rather watch Jordan Peterson, to be honest. But these are necessary. We're going to start with Obama when he was elected.
Is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible? Who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time? Who still questions the power of our democracy? Tonight is your answer. It's the answer told by lines that stretched around schools and churches in numbers this nation has never seen, by people who waited 3 hours and 4 hours, many for the first time in their lives, because they believed that this time must be different, that their voices could be that difference. It's the answer spoken by young and old, rich and poor, Democrat and Republican, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, gay, straight, disabled and not disabled, Americans who sent a message to the world that we have never been just a collection of individuals or a collection of red states and blue states. We are and always will be the United States of America. It's the answer that led those who've been told for so long by so many to be cynical and fearful and doubtful about what we can achieve, to put their hands on the arc of history.
All right, so I just wanted to point out what you just heard Obama say. It's to put their hands on the arc of history. So what I realize here is that the archetypes are recognized by so many people. The idea of like how things change. It's probably just on this subconscious level, but we do talk about the arc of history and the trajectory forward. So I do think like once you like internalize it, you realize, okay, there is an archetype. We can prop up the archetype. When somebody can express it the way like Obama is doing here, you can capture the minds of people and make them move towards the vision that you see. You'll see he talks about the problems of the past. He talks about the unity of everybody now. He's bringing in all these patterns that allow the majority of people to kind of attach to that mission and move towards it. So let's just finish watching what he says, and then we'll move on to the next one because I think that'll be an interesting contrast, and you will see how a different narrative was able to move people through time. It was fundamentally the same message, but we're going to watch them.
Bend it once more toward the hope of a better day. It's been a long time coming. But tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
Now we're gonna watch Trump, and you will see. You'll hear the same backgrounds in the audience. It's such a broad message. But it's the same message, just a little bit of a different tone. But it is still able to capture the minds of people, and that's what we're kind of seeing with the. If you understand the archetypes, these are the kinds of things that you see.
My fellow Americans, our movement is far from over. In fact, our fight has only just begun. We are one movement, one people, one family, and one glorious nation under God. So with American pride swelling in our hearts and American courage stirring in our souls, I say these words to you tonight. We will make America powerful again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America strong again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again. Thank you, Ohio. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, so basically you can see, like, maybe the wording is a little bit different, but both of these former presidents, well, both people who made it to the office, because Trump is still the president, were able to articulate the archetype that was needed in a time at the specific time. And now we can go back to Jordan Peterson and see the importance of this.
Question might be, what does the landscape of ultimate archetypes look like? And I think that's what I tried to lay out, and that's what I'm trying to lay out in this diagram. So now, why do you want to know that? There's a practical reason, or there's a number of practical reasons as well as intellectual reasons. One of the most relevant practical reasons, as far as I'm concerned, is that integrating narratives, and so those would include political narratives, integrating narratives have their force because they draw on universal archetypes. Otherwise they wouldn't have any power, right? Because they're basically stories. Political stories derive their power from the underlying archetypal representations. Obviously, because they have to be concerned with the things that people find important, right? How can you sell a political message to someone if it isn't about something they find important? And if it's important to them, it's going to be grounded at least to some degree in their biological substructure. I mean, if you're talking to hungry people about food, it's a story that you can tell, right? Because it hooks them deeply. It hooks deep into their motivational systems. To use a narrative of utopia, which is the land of milk and honey, roughly speaking, a very, very old idea, you're also tapping deeply into intrinsic human longings. And so the idea that political narratives incorporate archetypal themes is not really, it's not an idea that I would consider particularly controversial. Putting it that way might be. Okay, so the problem with political narratives, in my estimation, is that they can rapidly transform themselves into ideologies, and ideologies are dangerous for a variety of reasons, but the primary reason for their danger, I think, this is a hypothesis, is because of their one-sided nature. What happens is that they capitalize, parasitize, I think is even a better way of thinking about it, a profound underlying narrative, but they don't tell the entire story. And so then if you're looking for orientation in the world because you're fragmented and chaotic, and somebody provides you with a partial story, that's going to serve an integrating function. And it's one of the things you see in psychotherapy is that if you're chaotic and confused and you go see a therapist who has a particular kind of practice, Freudian, behavioral, cognitive, Rogerian, whatever, there's a high probability that undergoing that course of therapy is going to be good for you, and that you might even come to view your life in the terms of that therapeutic practice. And you might say, well, why is that therapeutic practice right for you? Maybe it could have been Rogerian instead of Freudian, say. And the answer to that is, yeah, well, it probably could have been, because roughly speaking, any coherent ordering principle is better than none. And so that's also a good way to think about human development from an intellectual perspective, is that partly what has to be provided to individuals as they mature into adults is some kind of ordering structure.
So I really want to touch on that point of the ordering structure, because basically I do think that is what the archetype really, that what it fundamentally does is it orders our instincts. It allows us to express our instincts, the instincts that we would express if we were an individual without a tribe or a community, the things that we would do as humans who never learned language or never learned um, how to relate with one another or another person. We do as humans probably have these deep instincts of like, we would go kill something in order for us to eat, right? We would probably take resource from people, right? Um, and then, as we evolved, we we wrapped these instincts basically into archetypes, um, things that gave us meaning. Because I do think, like, if we look at every animal, we can see like they do things that as humans we say we wouldn't do. Like a male lion may kill his cub or whatever. And I'm sure early humans had similar problems where it was like, because there was no meaning to a a male that his kin was born basically, there was a good chance that he would have like killed it. Maybe he became jealous that the kin was getting attention from the female. Um, and then, our society packed this into an archetype of father. And then, it gave the man meaning. Um, and that was probably one of the earlier archetypes. There were also other archetypes that have been explained of like, basically, how did we come to identify the world that we were living in? That's where I would say archetypes basically um, emerged from. It was the early patterns of being a human. Um, and it was probably even deeper than that, or the patterns that formed the first human. Um, like for anyone who doesn't know, I do a lot of neuroscience and biopsych type of research. Um, and one thing I've always found interesting is that um, the human cell, there isn't just one type of cell. There are multiple types of cells, and they all have a specific role. And we know that cells started as single cell like basically a single celled organism, and then they became multicellular, right? And I think just the way I look at it, basically these neural networks had to be constructed, right? Um, and there was probably a similar force in there where certain cells had to give up their autonomy to act in service of another one. Certain cells were probably more aggressive and took the control of another cell in order to create coherence within the body. And eventually, these created a hierarchy, and we know our brain works on hierarchy, um, that allowed an entire human to basically be formed, that can handle all of the complex patterns. We don't actually have to think about it. The patterns are being um, formulated underneath, right? And this is why I related this to epigenetics, because um, your genetics will send signals that your body should change the way it processes an input because of the epigenetics. It will say, okay, you know, um, a lot of times, like if your cortisol is high, it may trigger the way that you respond to stress, or something like that. And then then like a subtle thing that you can see is people start graying faster, um, or things like that. These are just more biological patterns. And now, as humans, we have more social patterns. That's one thing we should look at. And, another thing, because we've been in this little realm of politics, is like there used to be kings. And like now, you hear the narrative of no kings, right? Um, and at the same time, we don't really have kings in society the way that we used to. We aren't sending our soldiers on horseback to go to war or anything like that, but we have structures in our society that fulfill the role of king, right? Um, Even if it's, the president is not a king, but between the power of the president and all of his cabinet members, they have the power of a king. They have the power to influence health. They have the power to influence war. They have the power to influence social systems or education. And all these are points within a pattern, right? Within a pattern of control. And I think the idea that Jung was thinking about was that these patterns are on a trajectory to something certain. And that's kind of why I want to read the back of this, just so you get an idea, because I'm telling you, everyone thinks Jung was just personality. It wasn't just personality. And, you know, if you want to just talk about personality, you're kind of wasting your time. I'm just going to be honest. Because what you're going to realize in a couple of years is the same thing everybody who really understands archetypes realizes. Every pattern you see right now will change eventually. But anyways, so in this challenging and provocative work, Dr. Carl Jung, one of history's greatest minds, argues that civilization's future depends on our ability as individuals to resist collective forces of society. Only by gaining an awareness and understanding of one's unconscious mind and true inner nature, the undiscovered self, can we as individuals acquire the self-knowledge that is antithetical to ideological fanaticism. But this requires that we face our fear of the duality of the human, the existence of good and the capacity for evil in every individual. Jung compellingly argues that only then can we begin to cope with the dangers posed by mass society, the sum total of individuals, and resist the potential threats posed by those in power. So yeah, that's why, I don't want to let Jung's work go to waste. I don't want to sit here and act like we live in this world where it's like, oh yeah, you can be whatever you want to be. It's like, no, you have to fight for who you want to be. And the only way to do that is to recognize the archetypes and integrate them. And that is the truth. And you also have to have a higher order of meaning that allows you not to be possessed by the archetype. You want to integrate what is needed from the archetype. And we can evolve the archetype. Like we went from kings, we went from a soul leader, a king who ruled an entire nation, to now, we moved away from that. And, you have a president who gets the final say, but it's not without all of the power underneath, making sure that it aligns with the vision of where something is going. And it's the same thing with our cells. Our cells are communicating nonstop. Every time I move my hands, my cells are communicating. My brain is communicating with my limbs, through cells, through neurons, and sending signals. And there are different cells doing different roles. The same way, like, not everybody who works underneath the president and his cabinet are extroverted thinkers. They have a different archetypal role. They may be more about stabilizing what is. We just saw on the front of the White House, they had the big UFC fight. That's an archetypal pattern. When you look at gladiators or anything like that, that's a pattern of a powerful nation. Just realize that too. And our leaders, the people who make it to leadership position, realize the archetypal patterns, and they're able to use them to inspire, to drive change, to encourage people. And oftentimes, because they hit on all of those primitive things, they hit on the problems of the past, they show a trajectory forward, they pick up on all the pieces of right now, and then internally they're affecting the thoughts and feelings of somebody, people attached to this. And then it becomes like the driving force. And that's what Jordan Peterson and Jung were talking about. Like Jordan Peterson said, it may be controversial to say things a certain way. I don't really care. I never have. I will say it a certain way as long as I know, yeah, that really is how it works. And that kind of really is how it works. And then you see this at lower echelons of society. You see it in institutions. They all have their own narrative. They have their own extroverted thinkers. In the leadership position, they have their people that are distributing the narrative or the meme or whatever it is that organization is trying to do. And that's why you have to look at this from different levels of analysis. Um, and that's why, when you get into um, these smaller factions like the education system, yeah, you're going to have a very similar pattern, but it doesn't show up as like one archetype. Like you wouldn't name it that one archetype, because the important thing about the archetype is that you have to remember you have that self or the great man in between, um, and that's storing all of your memories, all of your experiences through life, and all of that kind of thing. And that is going to affect the archetype. So you can have an archetype emerge that is the same archetype from the past, but it is going to look completely different because of the individual who is possessed by that archetype, their experience, the change in the zeitgeist. Um, and and that's how I know like a lot of people's personality systems don't work, because they don't talk about the change of the zeitgeist. All Jung was trying to do was show people how things change. I mean, he was trying to warn people like, if people don't understand it, they will get possessed by it, because that is the truth.